Hello, welcome again, everyone, to another episode of Lifting the Fog. This is SANS's OSINT Open Source Intelligence live stream, and I'm John TerBush, the gumshoe on Twitter, co-author, along with David and Nico of the new Sec 587 Advanced OSINT class with SANS. Today, we have a very special guest, Ritu Gill, OSINT Techniques on Twitter. And we're going to be talking about investigating using open source information, sensitive groups, extremist groups. But before we dive into that, welcome. Hi, Nico, David, you want to say hi?
Hi, everybody. Welcome.
Hey, good to be back after my missing the live stream last month. So good to be back with you and Nico and with our guest.
Great to have you back. And before we get to Ritu, this is a live stream. Feel free to drop questions in, and we'll try and address them. So, Ritu, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me here. Happy to be here with you guys.
Why don't we start by having you explain a little bit about, your background, how you came into OSINT, and sort of what kind of work you do.
Yeah, okay, sure. So I have 15 years with the Canadian government. All of those is law enforcement. I worked for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for 12 years. I work for a different agency now. I also started my own consultancy, consulting business in 2016 called OSINT Techniques, which some of you might know me as. Because that's the handle I use online, on Twitter and all that. I got into OSINT a number of years ago when I was working with law enforcement, and just using open source to add to investigations. It was another technique that we use. So, whether there's the traditional kind of policing techniques that are used, open source intelligence or open source research was another thing we added to the list. And it was that's how I got into it. And really a lot of people ask hey, how do I start? Well, you have to start from the foundations. You have to start from the ground up. It's really hard to be hey, you can just show up and be at step 10 when you haven't hit step 1 and 2 yet. So that's a little bit about my experience. I'm quite out there online. You'll see a lot of Twitter posts from me or on LinkedIn. I'm quite involved with the OSINT community, and I really enjoy engaging the OSINT community and learning from other people. It's been a fun little go.
Awesome. Now, this is completely aside, but it just popped in my head, so I'm going to say it. Do you ever get to wear one of those really badass RCMP uniforms, like Dudley Do-Right style stuff?
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, so there's always confusion. Well, with the Mounties, right? That's what we call them. I'm not a Mountie. I was on the civilian side. I was on the civilian side as a public service person doing this work, so as an analyst. That's the difference. But hey, I know many Mounties in those red surges. They're quite. They stick out for sure.
Yeah. Okay. We'll get back to the OSINT, I promise.
Yeah.
So, why don't you tell us a little bit about kind of, and I know you can't give us details. You work for law enforcement, but a little bit of color into what we're talking about when we're talking about these sensitive extremist groups, and what are some of the tricky parts of investigating them from maybe an OPSEC side.
Yeah, for sure. So OPSEC, operational security, is definitely number one when you're doing open source research into any types of targets, especially with sensitive groups. You want to be even more aware of your footprint. And that can be challenging for certain agencies, or depending on if you work, for yourself or whatever it is. OPSEC is something that you want to make sure, because you don't want somebody coming after you, or something getting back to the agency that, hey, they're taking a look at my website. The footprints is speaking, hey, law enforcement from this area is looking at this content. Why are they looking? So, some of the things you definitely want to do is, you use VPNs. There's the other thing you want to do is use VMs, virtual machines, to protect yourself, because we end up clicking on a lot of things when we're going through some of our open source stuff. So those are just a couple of things. There's many more things you want to do. You want to have SOC accounts. Again, research accounts to protect yourself. I wouldn't want to conduct any research on any sensitive subject or group using my own Facebook profile. Right? I don't want to be like, hey, so these things are really important for good OPSEC. And, it's one of those things where you have to take the steps you have to have a process, right? Always have a process in how you do this. So I always look at it everyone comes from a different kind of perspective and workplace and whatnot, but having like SOPs in place in terms of how you're going to conduct yourself, how anybody working from that, unit will conduct themselves when they're doing this research. We will do A, B, and C. Again, those important things that will protect our privacy and security. That's.
I have a question. I have a question for you. So when it comes to these things that you just discussed, and let's imagine that you are now investigating a sensitive or hate group that is based in the Netherlands. That's your task. You're based over in Canada. What would you do? How would you set up your machine? How would you basically build your attack plan to try and identify that group based in the Netherlands?
Yeah. So, the first thing that sticks out to me is, okay, I'm in Canada, different time zone. If I'm researching a group, there's things, some people don't think about these, but hey, the time zone, right? What my computer says where I am, that's a footprint that could ultimately say something to someone who owns that website that I'm investigating. So setting up maybe my virtual machine using certain add-ons that would change, you can change, whether the time zone for sure, and the area I'm coming from. So not only would I do that, but I would use my VPN and make sure, you want to be aligned. I don't want it to stick out that there's somebody from a different location why would they be looking? I want to blend in. And that's the important part there. So that would be part of the plan for sure. What else can I think of? Those are the things that come to me like right away. Those are the things that stick out for sure.
Have you had to shift your own hours? I know some of the people that I work with that do cybercrime and stuff, if they're, working with Russians or Chinese or whatever, they end up working really weird hours because they need to be up when those guys are up, right?
Yeah. And not only that, like another point is, which I didn't mention, but, you don't want to be researching your targets 9 to 5, like a government worker. Like you got to think outside the box. If I'm the bad guy and somebody's visiting my website only Monday to Friday between the hours of 9 to 5 and then nothing, I might be, okay, this is interesting, and you don't know who is looking how closely at their own online footprint. So for me, you might need to change up your hours. You might need to change things on your end. And there's different ways of doing that, of course, right? Actually changing your hours to reflect that. Or it would be like a system, like you need to change your virtual machine footprint to make it look like it's a different time or whatnot.
Yeah, when I look at those examples, I did the same thing when I was in law enforcement. I set up my alarm clock in the middle of the night trying to investigate people, let's say, somewhere in the Middle East, or at least, let's say, time zone shift of 7 or 12 hours. I needed to change my keyboard language settings, needed to make sure that if I typed something with my sock puppet, that I spelled it in that correct language and also maybe in that correct character set, which could be different from the font type and character set that I'm using. So yeah, good examples, because I think that's what people tend to overlook. The adversaries that, especially when you're looking into sensitive groups, are very often tech-savvy people or groups that know that people online are looking at them, and they will
Right.
take those countermeasures. So yeah, I have an additional question. So let's say you had a broader question. Let's say you work for a nonprofit organization, and they just wanted to know the amount of far left and far right activity of groups in your country. How would you start? What would you do?
That's interesting. I mean, there's many different ways I think you can start off with. I always wonder, like, what is somebody starting off with? Like, what's your, what entities do you have, or selectors, or to work with? In that case, if you're hunting for information, to me, it's you're using open source. You're going to start with search engines to see if you can identify those groups in that area, whether it's something that's outright into news media articles. That's one part of it. A lot of that stuff doesn't always touch that, though. So for me, that's where those third-party resources come in, where there's certain organizations that will publish information about various groups and where they are located in the world. Their key leaders, some of their historical violent activities, and so on. So I find, like, some of these, like when I say third party, other websites, like I can name the Counter Extremism Project, for example. They do a great job of highlighting, like, groups, where they're from, the background, all that history there. So things like that. There's a lot of different ways you can do it, but I think the main thing is having a plan. If you don't have much to start with, like you're saying, you have to get out there and start looking first, because you don't know what you're going to find, especially when you don't have any background at all. It does, for me, I've spent a lot of time doing research, reading up on groups, who's located where, who's in this area, right? Kind of like what you've suggested.
Yeah. Yeah, in addition to that, what I always also like to do is like to look at, let's say, the opposite of the group that I'm trying to investigate. So maybe they're victims, because on average, a certain group might want to attack either online or physically that group. So if I'm capable of finding the victim group, very often I will find the individuals or the members that are part of a group that are trying to do bad things online, either that or physically. So there's a question coming in. Do you use dark web or social media feeds to look at extremist or sensitive groups?
So personally, like, I mean, yeah, I've used the dark web many times to explore. Most of the research I've done towards extremist groups has been on the surface web, though. Of course, I've used the dark web as well, but I find, like, they want to have more of a reach. So a lot of the content is on the open web, versus the dark web. Not to say there isn't anything. There is, of course, something when it comes to the dark web. In terms of social media, like, honestly, like, you can see things. I saw things, like, not even within this month, whether it's extremist groups on Facebook posting things, and these posts not being removed for a number of days. Videos and that kind of stuff still happens. Some people think, oh, it doesn't happen anymore. It actually does. So yeah, to answer that question, definitely I would say yes to both, but also I focus more on the surface web, because I think that's where the reach is, and that's what they're looking for.
Yeah, also when I look at the balance based upon my, let's say, almost 3 decades of experience, I think 70 to 80% of, let's say, sensitive group activity is mostly on the surface and clear web, just because that's where they have that reach in the audience, just like you told me. And of course, there will be groups that operate a little bit more, let's say, in the shade, but that's mostly, in my experience, and I don't know if you have seen the same thing, those more closed places, those echo rooms where like-minded people are planning something that will then drip down into the surface and clear web to gain more traction or lure other people in. Is that something that you've noticed as well?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, that seems very aligned with what I've seen. It's Just an example, actually, a number of years ago, I was seeing, there's different platforms that can be used to push out propaganda and whatnot, but like things like even the Wayback Machine, archive.org, for those of you, what you can do on that website is you can share links, you can create accounts, but some individuals or groups or people are posting maybe some extremist content there, and they use that to share amongst their groups links for access. And this stuff wasn't coming down. So it was kind of interesting how that was going.
We have another question here, which is kind of follows in with this a bit. Someone asked, like, what sort of communication platforms and things do you see people using? And I'll add to that kind of a two-parter here. So we have the people might be communicating kind of internally or more closed, and then they might have sort of, like we were talking about there, more of a public presence. So I understand that this is a widespread, perhaps, of platforms or services.
Yeah, I think definitely, like, people are using different ways to connect, but like those encrypted, those secure messengers or whatnot, for sure, there's going to be people creating groups and channels there. Things like, Telegram, but sometimes it's just a Telegram channel that you can join and you can see. Sometimes you don't have to join in, you can still see the content that's being shared amongst a group, or the messaging or the general feel of like what's going on here. Yeah, I definitely think there's various ways, but with encryption and, what the future kind of that part looks at, it gets a little tricky because, of course, we're talking about open source here, right? Open source. So what we have access to, if it's locked down behind a phone, it might look a little different in terms of what we can see, but, there's browser versions of certain messengers, like I mentioned, Telegram, which has been really actually helpful to find content through search engines, searching like keywords and whatnot.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I also noticed that there is some kind of a waterbed effect going on, where people used to be on those more centralized platforms, and now you see more platforms pop up that are decentralized, which makes it harder, or it makes it a little bit more censor resistant and harder to take down for governments when there is some, let's say, disturbing content being placed there. So that's also something, in addition to what you just told me, those more encrypted one-on-one chat apps or group chat apps, that I will see that there are open platforms that you can visit from an open source intelligence perspective, but from, let's say, a lawful perspective, it's pretty hard to take down or crack down those networks. So That's something that I just wanted to add. David, you had something?
Yeah, just the question in here that I saw posted I thought was interesting. We're looking at it from a non-law enforcement perspective because both Ritu and Nico coming from a law enforcement background. So the question is really about, how do I prioritize who I investigate, right? So is it the idea is I would think that it would really be based on the threat model of your organization, like who actually poses a threat to me. Kind of the same way I would take any threat actor. But I'd be curious for each of you to kind of weigh in on that as well and see what you think in terms of that question.
Yeah, so we have been talking, I think, mostly about extremist groups in the form of far right and far left. But for me, when we talk about groups and hate groups, it could also be, let's say, a ransomware group or a pedophile network. So basically any form of group activity that is trying to disrupt or make others feel really bad are important to me. So from that perspective, for example, one could also, let's do proactive, monitor your own infrastructure and systems for, let's say, a certain advanced persistent threat actor trying to get into your systems, or someone trying to take over accounts and do bad things with that. So that's definitely something that I do. But also what I like to do, since basically, I think it's kind of deformation from my former employer, is that I like to keep tabs on things. So there are certain keywords from which I know that could mean something for, let's say, an upcoming rally or demonstration, from which we all have seen the last 2.5 years that demonstrations can go sideways really quick. So you want to keep tabs on certain keywords just to make sure that you can take the proper countermeasures if needed. Ritu, do you have any take on this?
Yeah, I was gonna just the last part that you mentioned, using keywords. So like that's huge when you come across certain groups using certain hashtags or keywords. Like that's really big for us because you can take those now and plug those into different places, whether it's a search engine, which I definitely would do, but also things like social media platforms, like certain ones like Facebook, Instagram. You can plug in keywords and see if you get results. And often when it's something, like you mentioned, whether it's like some sort of rally, but they have, groups use certain keywords and hashtags. Last couple of years has said a lot about that, where you can end up finding more content as more events are created or set up, right, organized. So yeah, I find like keeping a tab on that, like, and sometimes we're not great at taking notes and making note of what we've done in that moment for that task. But I think it's really important because you don't know when you're going to have to revisit it. So you don't want to have to like go back and be like, what hashtag was that? You want to make note of it. So when someone asks, or you're like, hey, I'm going to go investigate that, you have the 10 hashtags they already use. It's going to make your life a lot easier. One other thing I just wanted to mention was with hashtags and key terms, if it's something that's on Twitter, I end up using TweetDeck quite a bit to like kind of monitor in real time any tweets associated to that. So it can make your life a lot easier. It's a social media monitoring tool. It's free right now. And it's just one of those ones that it can make your life a lot easier to find new content.
Yeah, and also in addition to that, what I've experienced is that a lot of threat groups, doesn't matter what kind of threat group, is that they will like to steal, let's say, a good hashtag for their own fun and profit. So I call it hashtag hijacking. We've seen that particularly during, let's say, large sports events where they know a lot of people are looking at that hashtag, doing searches based upon that hashtag, and now all of a sudden they will be exposed to maybe propaganda or horrific things. During the high rise of the Islamic State, they used it very often to spread their narrative and their message, trying to lure in new lone wolves or trying to trigger someone to do and join them. So that's definitely something that I think people who are starting out with monitoring or tracking sensitive groups of any form start looking for very generic, normal trending topics based upon hashtags. And you will notice once you start looking at that every now and then, one of these hashtags will be hijacked by one or more groups trying to send their agenda alongside with that pretty normal hashtag.
Yeah, it's almost like they're hiding in plain sight.
Yeah, all the time.
Yeah.
To follow on that, talking about jargon, a lot of groups, certainly ones we're talking about, they kind of create their own language sometimes, right? And that, I think, would help with monitoring if you're looking for certain keywords like that, and also for interacting with them if you need to do that with sock puppets and so forth, like really understanding the lingo.
Yeah. I think you should always do your homework on the subject matter, and that's, I think, a common mistake that people that start out with in open source intelligence, they just think, hey, I want to investigate group X, Y, or Z, but they know little to nothing about group X, Y, or Z. So you can literally go to a library, probably grab some books that will tell you something about what those groups are about, what kind of words they're using, where they're active, who their former leaders are, and who they look up to. And based upon that, well, you at least have a starting point.
Speaking of understanding, let me go a little bit analytical here. So in my experience, I haven't done a lot of, certainly not the extremist type groups. It's been more cybercrime or espionage actors, that sort of thing. But in my very distant past, I did do some work for an NGO doing undercover stuff into like a white nationalist, whatever group. And I found it was difficult to kind of get in their headspace, right? Like a criminal, I can understand. Someone that's trying to do espionage and collect information from another government, that makes sense. But getting into the headspace of some of these groups that just really want to hate, they want to kill other people, I find that's difficult. do you have any tips or thoughts on that? Because it is important to understand where they're coming from, to understand their operations, try to predict what they might be doing in the future, and so on.
Might give that one to Nico.
Okay, so I'll take it. So how I would look at that is it's pretty hard to understand an ideology. Why? Because it's something that someone believes in. This is why some people don't understand why people are Christian or Muslim, just because they don't understand that state of mind. This is why I think that it's really important to try and understand the leaders or the people that those individuals that are part of the group look up to, because 9 out of 10 times those are the thought leaders. They will share certain opinions and visions on how life should be based upon their perspective. So if you read up upon those people, very often you will understand better what they are interested in. Does not mean that you will now understand why they are doing it, because 9 out of 10 times it still doesn't make sense to me because, well, I'm not part of that group. But I now at least understand a little bit better where they're coming from. It could be a political ideology, could be based upon sexual preference, could be based upon money, could be based upon just simply disliking someone because they are bald, which is kind of strange to me.
Can't have that now. So.
No.
So pivoting over, and this will also address another question we have in the chat, is in terms of your go-to tools, what do you prefer, and how do you, to the extent you can disclose, and what is your typical methodology when you're building your case? How much are you able to automate those kind of things?
Yeah, so yeah, there's a lot I can't say, so I'm like, it's kind of interesting. That said, honestly, every task is going to look a little different in terms of what you're starting with. For me, kind of like what Nico's mentioned, like you need to know the background. You need to start with understanding the group, the basics, right? That's always important. But one thing that does come to me, and it just popped in my head, is there's many different tools you can use out there, and some are really basic where we're using like search engines, but that is like the bread and butter of how we find content. But there's others, like there's a website that I came across a while back called it's called smat.app or -app.com. So what they do is, this is again a third-party resource. It will search social media platforms pretty much for keywords, key terms, but it's finding content on those lesser known platforms. So we're not talking about like Facebook, we're talking about maybe Gab or Getter or Rumble, that kind of thing. But this could really help with the research. I've used it in addition to the number of other tools that I use. Yeah, so I guess it's smat-app.com. That's what I have. But yeah, that's one that came out, and I know a lot of people were tweeting about it and whatnot. But those are some of the ways you can find more content that may be of interest. Other thing that sticks out to me, and because I just feel like it's such a loaded question, there's so many different ways to answer that, but once you get really familiar with a group, one thing I've seen is, with social media and there's photos being posted, people will use things like logos or like hand signs. You want to get familiar with the group, what they do, but part of that is getting familiar with what types of logos are associated to that group. Or, when I say hand signs, there's certain hand signs that people will do in a photo that mean something. This could also include things like tattoos. So this kind of stuff may stick out to you, right? Or certain flags are used, right? These are the things you want to get familiar with. So you can understand, and you can also catch some of the things that you're looking for, because you can easily miss this, right? Because it's kind of a fire hose out there when we're looking at some social media things.
Yeah, I think when it comes to tools or tooling, on average, when I look at the pay tooling that I, for example, use, I use them mostly to speed up my processes. Why? Because I cannot scrape all the things by myself. First of all, it would cost me probably tons and tons of either cloud hosting services and tons of hard drives that could be really expensive. And sometimes just outsourcing that to a pay tool that you still pay a lot of money for, let's say every month or every year, it simply saves me tons and tons of time to keep tabs on things. But what I think is that people then still tend to overlook, hey, now you have a bunch of data. Now you have, let's say, 2 million of social media posts that all hit on 10 keywords that you are interested in.
Right.
Now,
How do you filter out that noise?
yeah, well, I think that's the hard part. That's where the INT within OSINT comes to play, is that you now need to sort through that data and see what it actually means. And that all comes back to, what's your research question? What answer are you looking for? What do you want to know? Are you looking for, let's say, the key players in a group that are facilitators? Are you looking for key players in a group that are leadership? Are you looking for, let's say, the young ones that are new and aspiring within the team? So those are 3 different questions in essence that all require different ways of looking at your data, and maybe parsing that data with making use of certain scripts and algorithms to quickly go through those millions and millions of messages. So there is no number one answer for this. I think the number one answer is that you must define a good research question, and based upon that, you can make decisions how to sort through the data that you have collected.
Yeah, so you have to hone in and really identify, I guess, those objectives, right, of what you want to get done. Yeah, because it could be a lot of information, often too much information. So yeah, that makes sense to me.
And a key part of that is going to be understanding your organization's intelligence requirements, what you're worried about, right? Like if you're law enforcement, you're worried about crimes being committed generally. So, you know, that might be very different than an organization that's like a nonprofit that's just tracking these groups or whatever.
Yeah, I remember, for example, recently I did a consultancy gig for, let's say, a higher net worth person that was traveling to a country that was listed to be somewhat unsafe. And they just wanted to know, based upon that, hey, what threat groups are active in that country? Could they potentially be interested in me as a high worth net worth person? And what kind of countermeasures can I take based upon that obtained knowledge coming from open source intelligence? So that could also be a way to look at gathering and collecting the data to keep someone safe who's going to travel somewhere.
Right.
Absolutely. All right. Any other questions? David, you have any?
No, just again, kind of looking through some of the comments here for the live stream. Now, again, this is another one that's interesting. So if you're doing OSINT and you're looking at a particular group of interest, is there some threshold at which point you may say, hey, I'm non-law enforcement, this is something I should report? Is there kind of, I don't know, there are certain cases in the US where there's mandatory reporting for some things, especially if you're in certain roles like teacher and things like that. But a little different as a researcher. Is there any kind of rule of thumb, Nico or Ritu, given your experience in law enforcement, you say, hey, this is something law enforcement would care about versus, hey, this is just more noise, it's not going to get looked at?
Ritu, want to take this one?
Yeah, I think it depends. Like, see, I mean, right when I see a question like that, I just think like, okay, you know, where is it seen? What did you see? Like, I mean, there's just so much information out there. Like, I mean, if I see a crime's being committed or whatnot, again, like, I mean, what country are you in? Like, finding the right person to report that back. Like, but even like Crime Stoppers, right? Anonymous, that type of thing. Yeah. How do you report something you found to law enforcement? I would, you have to decide. Yeah, I don't know the best way to answer that, but I think like really like if I see something criminal, I see something, you know, against the law, and I'm like, okay, you know, if there's any victims, that kind of thing, if something really pops out to me like that, I would definitely want to give a heads up and one of the ways that you could do that anonymously, if that's what you want to do, is through Crime Stoppers, which is international, right?
Yeah.
Any other thoughts on that?
Well, I tend to look at it also from mostly what I experience is protecting the younger ones, the children. Every now and then, investigators will stumble upon, let's say, child abuse content, pedophile network content, especially for those who are trying to dig into the deep and dark web of this world. It's not uncommon that you will, by accident, be exposed to a forum that's maybe mostly about credit card fraud, but they have a sub forum that's all of a sudden pointing you towards all kinds of disturbing content. Well, I think you at least want to disclose that you found that, and then they can decide what they want to do with that. Other way around, for example, recently I noticed that in a very popular app amongst younger kids, Roblox, there's a lot of grooming going on. There's a lot of people trying to lure younger kids into doing sexual activities or trying to extort them from their Robux virtual money. I just didn't know that, for example, Dutch law enforcement knew about that. So I just phoned them and just told them, hey, I'm an investigator. I do this in my own time. I stumbled upon this. I don't know if you know about it. I noticed it, but now you know. This is where to find it. If you want me to send you all the details in a PDF, more than happy to do so. But I just think that's just OSINT for good in general. I think most people that I know, when they stumble upon something that they say from their gut, hey, this is wrong, this is off, they will at least let people know in their inner circle. And based upon that, it will spread and it will end up with those that may want to take action.
Yeah. From kind of a non-law enforcement perspective, because I have not worked in law enforcement, though I've worked with them on things. I think it is kind of that see something, say something. If there's something that just seems really off, reach out. If you're in an organization, talk to your legal department about it. If you are, private investigator or journalist or something, you probably know some law enforcement people. Ask them about it. Or just reach out to, the website for your state that asks for things like you mentioned, Ritu. So there's always avenues to share this information, whether anything gets done with it or not. That's kind of out of your hands. Right?
Yep.
Right.
And that's a great point. I mean, I've actually been working incident recently where we had how we want to engage with law enforcement. And, we went to our general counsel and said, hey, what do you want to do? How should we do this? Does this meet the threshold that we think we should notify law enforcement? And if we're going to do that, how do we coordinate that? And that is something that if you have legal counsel, can certainly give you some guidance there. So that's a great point, John.
Yeah, and this is why we always keep track of every step we do in our investigation, because we may end up seeing something that is forbidden within your country. For example, in the Netherlands, it's 100% illegal to just view child abuse content. And that's something when you need to investigate, let's say, a pedophile network, you're bound to be exposed to one or more pieces of content. So how can you investigate that if you are not, let's say, within the government, but still want to report that because that's your core skill, trying to find those groups? So that's something that you need that legal backup. And before you actually open up your laptop and start digging and searching, that you need to make sure with your legal department, hey, 9 or 10 times the question, can I, is yes, but may I? Definitely not always.
Yeah, this is one of those things where it makes sense to have some understanding before you stumble across that site or whatever, right? So what are the things that I must report to law enforcement? What are the things I should, or things like that? And as Nico said, like maybe you need to document that at the very least. Most of us have worked cases where you saw something and you go back a day later and it's gone, right? You didn't document it and you should have. So try to document those things. Again, understand the law. You shouldn't be copying certain things, right? But if it makes sense, and legal department signs off on it, sometimes saving that documentation so it can be used in a court case or something is a good idea.
Yeah, that's why I just go back to SOPs and having that established kind of, how you're going to conduct your business, essentially, right? How you're going to conduct your OSINT work is so important. Kind of interesting as we're talking about this topic. One thing that comes to mind is we talked about graphic kind of things that you might see. I find when it comes to researching some of these sensitive groups, you can end up seeing some graphic violence, graphic things that could be quite disturbing. But it reminds me of a blog that Nico wrote. Just it's something that we have to be very aware of when
The
we
vicarious.
are, yes, vicarious trauma. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that one, it's on OSINT on the OSINT Curious blog site. Maybe we can share the link. But it's just, how can you protect yourself? Because after years of doing some of this work, you quickly realize things that might help you. And I think Nico did a great job of highlighting some of the things to be aware of, and how you can kind of protect yourself better, right, in the online world, because you don't know what you're going to click on and you don't know what you're going to see.
Yeah, and also prevent from becoming detached from reality. I think, especially looking back at the last 2.5 years, where certainly a lot of people became detached from reality due to everything that went on online. That also is part of taking care of your own, let's say, sanity and state of mind. It's okay to be skeptical about things that are happening on the internet, but don't exaggerate it when you do these things. There are two questions that I wanted to touch upon, because I saw several people ask questions on, hey, do you use social engineering to understand a little bit more about certain groups, or do you infiltrate certain groups? I would like to hear your 2 cents upon that, Ritu.
Yeah.
If you can share.
Yeah, I was gonna say, well, I'll just word it accordingly. I would say when you're exploring some of these groups, I think so it really depends on your agency. If you work for an agency or organize whatever company you work for, or maybe you don't, but you need to see what's okay and what isn't okay. So this goes back to, I think of right away, are you conducting passive OSINT, or are you able to engage? And what does engagement mean, right? Sometimes for some organizations, passive means I can only look and I cannot touch anything. I cannot join groups. But sometimes it might mean, no, I'm allowed to join a group. So if you are allowed to do these things and you're authorized to do that, like, I think when there's a large enough group and you need to make sure you blend in, and you want to see whether it's that Telegram channel that you're part of and there's already 10,000 people in it, so you have to step back and ask yourself the questions again from the OPSEC perspective too.
Yeah.
And then go from there. So, and this could be like a Facebook group. You could be like, if there's 5 people, you might not want to join that, because that's going to make your life a lot harder to blend in, because they're probably going to want to know who's this new person, right? But if there's hundreds and hundreds or thousands, that's a different story. So I think it really depends on a few things, but I think that is a good way to get insight on what's going on, right? Of course, it's going to be platform specific. So Facebook groups are going to look very different than Telegram channels, vice versa. There's various other places. But I do think that is one method of gaining insight of what's being shared, what kind of content, what their objectives are, what events do they have planned.
Yeah, and also I think that the most scary part for me most of the times is that you now have a new challenge as an investigator. You need to have a totally different alibi and backstopping story, because most OSINT work is passive. It's just looking around and grabbing the information. But once you start engaging, people will engage to you as well, or could be. So they could ask questions. So if they ask questions, what's your answer? And how do you answer? How do you word your answer? Are you going to do that again between 9 and 5? Or are you going to do that outside of office hours? Are you going to use foul language to maybe wave someone off and say, hey, go yourself and I will not talk to you? Because you need to act like you're a normal person on the internet, and not every normal person on the internet will talk normally. So you need to maybe start talking slang. You need to maybe start talking lead speak or hackerish kind of speak. So, and with that, I think the biggest challenge mostly is that the risk of being compromised from our operation perspective goes up immediately 1,000%. because now all of a sudden I'm having an open line with someone, and they could basically inject all kind of files, because they may say, hey, I want you to look at this document before you can join this group. You open a document, you click on it, and now your system is compromised. Or they want you. Sorry, I even had an example when I was trying to get into, let's say, an Islamic State group, that they wanted to pledge. I needed to pledge the allegiance on camera. I'm like, that's interesting, because that's not going to happen. And with that, what do you do? How are you going to deal with that? Are you going to say, hey, my camera's broken, or F you, I don't want to pledge the allegiance on camera because I know people are looking at us and I don't want to expose myself on a camera? Because there could be all kinds of, let's say, plausible excuses why you don't want to do that. But those are things that I think you might want to think of beforehand, instead of at the moment when someone asks that question.
I think there's two parts of this, and they're both things you need to plan well beforehand. One of those is, like with reporting, what am I allowed to do? What can I do? In your legal department, or if you're in law enforcement, it's kind of drilled into you. I can do stock and stuff, or I can't. You're right. You got to figure that out. And then there's the whole operational side. How do you do it? How do you engage and get the data that you need without exposing yourself?
Yeah, no, definitely. Even things like, Nico, you mentioned one thing, like, I mean, someone could, if you're actively engaged, and say you're talking to them and chat, they could ask you, hey, show me your desktop. If it was my work computer, a work computer, it's going to look very different, right? My personal computer, my folders on my desktop look really different. So you've got to be ready for some of these things, but that's where that active engagement, I guess, it can be a lot trickier.
And one might even debate on if that's still open source intelligence, because
exactly,
especially one-on-one conversations are definitely, in my book, not always open source intelligence. It's more geared towards human intelligence, virtual human intelligence, which could be considered to be an open source, because if that person is willing to be open with the information that they are sharing, you could walk into a bar, into a stadium, and start a conversation, which is also an open source. So there's always a thin line when it comes to that discussion. We always have people cringing and saying, like, is that really open source? And where other will say, yeah, that's, in our book, it's still part of open source. I think it's a very thin line that you're walking there.
Just being realists, a lot of people that do focus on open source work will end up doing that kind of work too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, especially if you want to take it to the next level, the more advanced level, and we are talking about extremist and sensitive groups. 9 out of 10 times, in my personal experience, getting deeper into those networks and understanding them deeper, and maybe preventing even a terrorist attack on your country or someone else's country, will definitely help once you can engage with certain targets.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Any final thoughts? This was a great episode, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
I thought it was great. There's some great questions coming in and whatnot. I'd just say I wanted to share a resource that I use, and it is, I don't have the link, but maybe we can put it up, but it's Laurent Bodo's Terrorism and Radicalization Dashboard. So a website that I use where there's all sorts of helpful links and resources to research some of these groups. I talked about the background, getting that background information on some of these groups. Well, I know Laurent has many different links there that would be useful to you guys. So just wanted to share that.
Yeah, that's a great resource. And of course, Laurent has a lot of experience in investigating in hate groups. I've used that. It's basically a start me page where he collects all kinds of research paper, but also methodologies, techniques, browser add-ons that you can use for your radicalization or extremist group investigation. So great addition. Thank you for that.
Yes. Ritu, any final things you want to share, projects you're working on or anything like that?
Just keeping busy. I don't have anything specific. Hey, check out the OSINT Curious blog as always. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, if you don't already, my handle is OSINT Techniques. I'm also on LinkedIn and many other places. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions directly.
Awesome. Thank you, Ritu, for joining us. Please give her a follow on Twitter. Nico, David as well, thank you for joining and your great questions. Everybody, I hope you enjoyed the show. We'll see you again next time.
See you again next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.